Right, so again, what we really have here is a tripart operation, Vatican SS and OSS U.S. intelligence, to get the Nazis out of Europe and Italy in particular. Now, it's worth noting here that Cardinal Montini, again, goes on to become Pope Paul VI later on, and we're going to look at the association of Paul VI with many of the, the successors to some of these same elements we're talking about in future broadcasts in this special series on Vatican politics. Now, it's worth noting here, again, that this rat line served to get many of these Nazis out of Europe and into the service of the U.S. intelligence agencies, one or another, either the Counterintelligence Corps of the Army, the fledgling CIA and its Galen affiliate, or Galen wing, really, I should say, or any other aspect of U.S. intelligence. And it, again, Montini's role with Udall in this is front and center, and it's worth noting here that then Bishop Montini was he a bishop or a cardinal here? Bishop.
At what time?
Monsignor Montini.
He was Monsignor when this thing first thing started. He later became an archbishop and then a cardinal.
Okay, Monsignor Montini at this point. My church denominations are not the clearest, obviously, my understanding of them. Monsignor Montini at this point had already been working for U.S. intelligence for some time. Reading now a short section from a book called OSS, The Secret History subtitled The Secret History of America's First Central Intelligence Agency, authored by R. Harris Smith, published in hardcover by the University of California Press, copyright 1972. Now, in this book, the author Smith describes Monsignor Montini working as a U.S. intelligence agent, specifically in order to provide Vatican intelligence on bombing targets in Japan to the United States. So, even while the Vatican is cooperating with Hitler and Mussolini, they're currying favor with the United States by providing them with aerial intelligence, or with intelligence for their aerial attacks on Japan. One of the key people involved in this is Monsignor Giovanni, but actually it says here an intense cardinal, Monsignor Giovanni Battista. So he was a cardinal at this point. Reading about this, by the way, it was called the Vessel Project. Reading about Montini's wartime work for U.S. intelligence, and again remembering that later on he was instrumental in providing Vatican passports for many top Nazis to leave Italy, many of them wound up working for U.S. intelligence. Smith writes as follows in OSS. The attention of Italian planners at Donovan's headquarters had been diverted to a top-secret priority operation codenamed the Vessel Project that had nothing to do with Italian intelligence. In late 1942, Washington received an incredible proposal from Vatican City, then an independent diplomatic enclave in the center of fascist Rome. A high official of the Papal Secretariat offered to furnish the Americans with first-hand information on strategic bombing targets in Japan, obtained by representatives of the Holy See in Tokyo. OSS accepted with alacrity, and a complex espionage network was born. The intelligence from the Japanese capital was sent to a contact at the Vatican, then relayed to the Irish embassy in Rome. With the secret approval of Premier de Valera, the information passed by Irish diplomatic pouch to Dublin. There it was collected by Riccardo Mazzarini, an anti-fascist émigré who represented the SI Italian desk in London. That's the British Special Intelligence. Transmitted in special naval code to Washington, the data was then analyzed and compiled at OSS headquarters by an ex-colonel of Mussolini's Air Force, an air attaché at the Italian embassy in Tokyo before his defection, unquote, to the United States. This circuitous process took only a matter of days and provided Washington with vital Japanese intelligence in the spring of 1943. The Vessel Project was masterminded by two men. The Vatican agent was a thin, intense cardinal, Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, later to become Pope Paul VI. His fellow OSS conspirator, Earl Brennan, a veteran of the State Department's consular service and Republican member of the New Hampshire legislature, headed the SI desk in Washington. Well, I guess SI was not, that's, anyway, that is a branch of U.S. intelligence here, working obviously with OSS. I'm going to have to double check just what that reference is to. Anyway, continuing here. Educated in Italy as a boy, Brennan had later returned to Rome to join the American embassy staff during the first years of the fascist regime. Working closely with another young Foreign Service officer, David Bruce, Brennan befriended the chief of Mussolini's Secret Service, leaders of the powerful Italian Masonic Order, and we'll be talking about that Italian Masonic Order later in this series, high-ranking fascist officials, and the Duce himself. So again, Pope Paul VI, at that time Cardinal Montini, was actively working for U.S. intelligence during World War II in light of the U.S. intelligence involvement with the Rat Line and the fact that many of the people evacuated via the Rat Line went directly into the work for U.S. intelligence. It's we're speculating the possible role of U.S. intelligence in directly influencing Montini's efforts in that regard.
And we're going to talk about one place, at least, where the U.S. played a role, but also we're going to introduce one of our key players who is going to be showing up time and time again during these 5 broadcasts, a man who himself first became affiliated with most of the people that he is going to be showing up with later on at the end of World War II and the financing and organization of the Rat Line.
I just remembered what SI stands for. That is actually a subdivision of OSS. What that is, it refers to Special Intelligence, and in fact the Special Intelligence Division of OSS during World War II, interestingly enough, in Europe was headed up by William Casey, currently director of the CIA. That's that reference. SI refers to the Special Intelligence Division of the OSS. It's a branch of OSS.
Another member of the Knights of Malta.
Yep. In the Knights of Malta, we're going to be talking about a little later in the broadcast.
Absolutely. Anyway, back to the subject of yet another one of our main players who's going to come up time and time again, a man by the name of Licio Gelli. First name Licio, last name Gelli. Licio Gelli, who is going to be one of the most key players in the entire inspection of who shot Pope John Paul II and why.
He could be looked at as the hub of the Mediterranean merry-go-round, perhaps.
Absolutely. And Licio Gelli, again, as so many of these people did, first came into this strange kind of crossing over area between the Vatican, fascism, and intelligence at the end of World War II. And in the formation of the Rat Line that we have been talking about. Reading from David Yallop's In God's Name, talking about Licio Gelli and the formation of the repellent individual he grew to be, by the age of 17 he had already acquired a hatred of communism comparable to King Herod's attitude toward the firstborn. As members of the Italian Black Shirt Division, Gelli and his brother fought alongside Franco's army against the communists in Spain. Of this period in his life, Gelli observes, quote, "Only I returned alive," unquote. During the early stages of the Second World War, Gelli fought in Albania. Subsequently, he obtained the rank of Oberleutnant in the SS in Italy and worked for the Nazis as a, quote, liaison officer. His work involved spying on the partisans and betraying them to his German masters. Some of his early wealth was derived from his presence in the Italian town of Cattaro, where during the war the national treasures of Yugoslavia were hidden. A significant proportion of those treasures have never been returned to Yugoslavia, but were stolen by Gelli. Gelli's early devotion to a hatred of all things communist lessened in direct proportion to the defeats suffered by the Axis powers as the war progressed. He began to collaborate with the Italian partisans, who were largely communists. Thus he would locate a partisan hideout, dutifully tell the Germans, then advise the partisans to move before the raid. He continued to play both ends against the middle throughout the remainder of the war, and was one of the last of the fascists to surrender in northern Italy, close to where a young priest, Albino Luciani, had been hiding partisans in Belluno. And Albino Luciani is the man who eventually becomes Pope John Paul I, about whose death this book In God's Name is written.
And we'll be talking about next week, by the way.
Gelli's agreement to continue to spy for the communists after the war was instrumental in saving his life when he faced an anti-fascist commission sitting in Florence. The evidence that he had tortured and murdered patriots was deemed, after discreet intervention by the communists, to be insufficient. Having been cleared of these charges, he immediately organized a rat line for Nazis wishing to flee to South America. His fee was 40% of their money. Another organizing member of the rat line was a Catholic priest from Croatia, Father Krujoslav Draganovic. Among the men who escaped was Gestapo chief Klaus Barbie, usually referred to as the Butcher of Lyon. Barbie was not obliged to pay either Father Draganovic or Gelli. The cost was borne by the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, which employed Barbie in espionage work until February 1951. Okay, several interesting things to look at. First of all, Licio Gelli's early involvement is, as they mentioned, in playing both sides against the middle. Licio Gelli's involvement as a man of connections, because this is what made Licio Gelli, as Dave mentioned, the hub of the Mediterranean merry-go-round, and one of the kingpins of Italian politics. Not a man whose face or name were well known, but a man who got things done and who was a mover and shaker. Now, interestingly enough, we note that Yallop suggests that a lot of Licio Gelli's early monies came directly from the Yugoslavian national treasure, which was being stored in Cattaro, Italy. Interestingly enough, about not too long after that particular involvement of Licio Gelli's with Yugoslavian money, they talk about his involvement along the rat line with Father Draganovic. Now, again, they call him Croatian priest Father Draganovic, but of course Croatia was merely a subset of what was Yugoslavia before the war and what is Yugoslavia today. So one has to wonder if there was any kind of a deal, any kind of information that passed between Draganovic and Licio Gelli for the betterment of the fascist cause as to where the Yugoslavian national treasure was being stored and how it could be gotten to.
Of course, Draganovic, recall in the passage from the Nazi legacy that we looked at, Draganovic was a Vatican ecclesiastical advisor, quote unquote, to the Pavlich regime, the Ustasha regime. And again, the fact that Gelli served as an Oberleutnant in the SS, then, according to Yallop here, a key figure in setting up the rat line. The rat line, recall, was the Bishop Udall, Allen Dulles, OSS, Operation Bernhard-funded exit line. And interestingly enough, we see Father Draganovic coming back into this very same picture. And again, Licio Gelli is going to be a primary player, so his role here, at least according to Yallop, in helping to set up the rat line, which eventually he took advantage of himself, is worth taking note of. Also, the fact that he was willing to play ball with the communists to a certain extent is perhaps instructive, because we're going to take a look at Licio Gelli's role with, among other things, the possible formation of the Red Brigades in Italy. So what we're really looking at with this passage is a seeding which will hopefully grow and blossom in the weeks to come.
The Red Brigades and also possibly connections in Bulgaria to various factions there, which is also fairly mysterious that we're going to talk about. Last but not least in this little passage, which is nonetheless chock full of stuff, is the fact that, as they mentioned, that Klaus Barbie, while utilizing the rat line, was not, in fact, obliged to pay for this service to Draganovic or to Gelli because of, this was being paid for by the USCIC, the Counterintelligence Corps. What is not mentioned here, but is mentioned, I think, elsewhere in this book, is the fact that Klaus Barbie, as we have found out now, actually got out of the clutches of the Allied War Crimes Commissions with the direct aid of the American Intelligence and Military Intelligence Corps. And in fact, not only that, but then they turned around and lied to the French as to his whereabouts. So within, again, weeks after World War II, not that we weren't doing a lot of other things at this time also that we've talked about in the past, but among other things we were lying to our French allies about the whereabouts of a wanted war criminal.
Now again, Klaus Barbie goes to work, avails himself of the rat line in partnership with Licio Gelli, goes to work for U.S. intelligence, first in Europe, as there are a number of books, a large number of books have come out about Klaus Barbie. It's then worth noting that after going to Latin America via the rat line, he works for U.S. intelligence down there. We're going to be looking at that for weeks in the remaining broadcast in this series. And what we're going to be specifically looking at in connection with Klaus Barbie is his continued association through various elements, primarily a fascist named Stefano Della Chiai, with Licio Gelli and his Propaganda Due Lodge, a crypto-fascist government of Italy, which actually has functioned sort of as an international fascist organization for a number of years. And again, the Gelli and Barbie association with the rat line, and in turn Father Draganovic's reappearance here, Draganovic instrumental in sheltering Barbie, by the way, it not only is a recoalescing of elements we've looked at earlier in the broadcast, but we're going to be looking at how some of these associations have developed still later on.
Okay, but before we do that, and before we look into Klaus Barbie's triumphant entrance into the New World and his contacts there, and the beginnings of a larger series of contacts between such organizations as the Vatican, the United States Central Intelligence Agency then just being born, and such other organizations as Die Spinne, the Nazi expatriate organization under the command of Otto Skorzeny and others, we are going to take a break, because that's what we need to do right now. So while we're doing that, you can all get up and stretch, or if you're listening to this on your car tape player or something like that, you can make a couple of wild left turns into traffic or something and kind of loosen the old muscles up. We will be back with more of Radio Free America then, in just a matter of minutes, and we will continue with our look at the expanding of the rat line into South America and the beginnings of the formation of what we are going to be calling, over this series of 5 broadcasts, the Mediterranean merry-go-round. So don't go away. Dave Emery and myself, Nip Tuck, will return with more of Radio Free America in just a few moments. Subject matter at hand. We have been following up till this point. Again, this is the first, for those of you just tuning in or who are tuned in partway through the last hour or something and are not aware of what we're talking about, this is the first of a 5-part series on what we have dubbed the Mediterranean Merry-Go-Round, which is the revolving series of events that surround the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. And one of the things that we felt was very important for people to understand were the antecedents of these events, because so oftentimes, in terms of contemporary history, or what is called news today, and which often passes itself off in place of history, virtually no attention whatsoever is given to what happened beforehand. And such was certainly the case in the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, in which a lot of people sprang forward and started throwing out theories, none of which seem to have any basis in historical reality whatsoever. So in propounding some theories of our own, we are first going to cover the historical background of the events and let our listeners understand exactly where these people were situated in the political issues of their day and what their actual involvement with these cases were, starting way back in the crucible of most of these events, which was World War II. And so far we've talked about the early concordats, the early treaties between the Vatican Church and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And we've talked about the fact that the great liberty of movement that was given to these fascist governments by the Vatican in return for certain control that the Vatican was able to reassume in Italy, and great sums of money, and of course the tacit agreement on both sides that the fascist governments would pursue relentlessly and ruthlessly that great enemy of the church, atheistic communism. Now, one of the person who most personified, I suppose, this particular series of agreements and accommodations made between the church and fascism was a man named Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII, but not before a long series of maneuvers, starting with, as we showed at the beginning of the broadcast, the actual donation of money when he was papal nuncio in Munich to Adolf Hitler on behalf of the church to fight atheistic communism, and later on including his role as Secretary of State of the Vatican with his brother Francesco Pacelli, a lawyer, in helping to actually negotiate the Lateran Treaty of 1929 between the Vatican and Mussolini's fascist government in Italy.
Also played a key role in negotiating a similar agreement with Hitler, with whom he then achieved a rapprochement after Pius XI had begun to condemn Hitler's persecution of Catholics in the church.
Absolutely. And as the war wound to a close, first of all, we also looked at the fact that Pope Pius XII, which was the papal name that Eugenio Pacelli took when he became Pope, Pius XII basically stood by while hideous acts of terror were visited upon, for instance, the Serbians, Gypsies, Jews, and other non-Catholics of Yugoslavia by the Croatian Ustasha. And as far as the church's support of the fascists in Spain and various other places, and we talked about what we're talking about now. We led into the discussion of how, as the war was winding down and the eventual defeat of the Axis became obvious, that people like Martin Bormann and Freddie Schwend became very interested in squirreling away large amounts of money to help the Nazis get out of Europe. And one of the ways they did this was through Operation Bernhard, a massive counterfeiting scheme, counterfeiting mostly British and some American money. And that this money was then used in conjunction with the aid of American intelligence, which was interested in supporting any sort of anti-communism, no matter how foul that anti-communist might be, and the Vatican itself, which also had a certain interest in anti-communism, that this money and the SS, the Vatican, and the CIA, or before the CIA, the OSS and Central Intelligence, and Counterintelligence Corps of the military, all got together to help get the Nazis, especially the top-ranking Nazis, out of Europe. And we talked last about Bishop Alois Hudal, a pro-Nazi bishop, originally born probably in Germany, perhaps in Austria, who, with the help of Cardinal Giovanni Montini, later to become Pope Paul VI, actually got Martin Bormann and Schwend and some other high-ranking Nazis Vatican passports that proclaimed them as priests, the highest amount of security the Vatican could throw behind somebody, and then allowed them to get to safety in Latin America.
We also took a look at Licio Gelli, a lieutenant in the SS, an informer, a liaison officer between the Italian fascists and the SS, a supporter of Mussolini, and a man who basically was emerging at this time as an international manipulator. According to David Yallop, he helped set up the Rat Line, along with Bishop Udall and also Father Draganovic, who was a Vatican emissary to the Croatian fascist government during World War II. And Licio Gelli, of course, eventually went on to become head of the P2 Lodge, and the P2 Lodge is going to be a key player in the rest of the broadcasts in this Vatican series. And Father Draganovic helps Klaus Barbie, who will be associated with Licio Gelli for a long time. Don't forget, too, that the Vatican Bank itself was begun in 1942 and that the assets which wound up in it were generated by the very same Pacelli-affected Lateran Treaty with Mussolini.
That's right. And as we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, that Lateran Treaty of 1929, among other things, besides literally making the Catholic Church the state religion of Italy and allowing the Catholic Church a great deal of leeway as well as being a sovereign state. One of the things it also did was to give a lump sum of money to the tune of about $100 million directly to the Vatican, which then used it to form the basis of the Vatican Bank funds that would go on to play such an important part in some of the events we're going to be looking into. Now, later on, we mentioned that Operation Bernhardt came up with, during the course of their counterfeiting operations, came up with a result of about $600 million, of which only about $39 million of which have been actually traced, and we have to assume that a large part of the other $550 or so million found its way into and surrounding the area surrounding the Rat Line, including probably the Vatican. Certainly, a lot of palms were greased, and it would not be completely sacrilegious to suggest that some of them may have belonged to people wearing religious robes of some sort, especially when you look at the work of Alois Udall and others of his ilk.
Basically, the Rat Line is, as we said, a tripartite operation, part SS, part Vatican, part U.S. intelligence.
Okay, now we are returning to
the Borman Brotherhood.
Borman Brotherhood by William Stevenson, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the track of money. And remember, the firmest law of this kind of research is watch the money and watch where it goes, and that's what we're attempting to do right now.
And again, bearing in mind that tripartite operation, what Stevenson's going to be talking about here is how eventually those people attempting to track Operation Bernhard funds appear to have been dissuaded by the very U.S. intelligence which was participating in this tripartite arrangement.
Now, the William Stevenson who wrote the Borman Brotherhood, it should be mentioned, is not the same William Stevenson that he talks about in this section of the book.
Yeah, the William Stevenson in this section is spelled Stephenson. He was head of British intelligence in the Americas during World War II, codenamed Intrepid. Also, although it's not mentioned here, a man who played footsie with the Nazis quite a bit, as we looked at an American swastika. That's different than the author of the book, who is William Stevenson, Stephenson, who also worked for the British in World War II.
The search for Nazi funds, Stevenson writes, was left to those not stifled by legal devices designed to protect bureaucrats from the penalties of their own mistakes. Ernest Caneo, who had kept his special status within White House circles after Truman took up residence, checked with Sir William Stevenson in the 1950s a series of reports from different sources in South America, all suggesting that Nazi funds were behind certain business activities. His information was independent confirmation of what Stevenson himself had heard. Stevenson had a considerable knowledge of German routes for couriers, agents, and smugglers. During the war, his intelligence net included at least one reliable observer on every neutral vessel sailing between the American continent and Europe. And these observers, as a matter of course, reported on arrival in port to the local British Secret Service agent. At every civilian airport, he had men among the ground technicians and occasionally aboard the aircraft. One reason for his obstinate refusal to sabotage aircraft or ships was that he was protective of his own men. But also, as a pilot, he could never bring himself to destroy a plane and crew by such methods. His operations were shared with the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. Between them, it was agreed in 1945 that dirty money and Nazis on the run might be expected to move along well-defined routes. But at some point, and for reasons that one can now speculate upon, the curiosity of the two, quote, happy amateurs, Stevenson and Caneo, was curbed. They knew that Brazil and Venezuela were the chief sources of industrial diamonds, needed by Hitler's war production minister Albert Speer. And they also knew that after the war, the trade went on. Platinum had been a vital commodity, purchased with gold or convertible currency from Colombia and Ecuador. It was required for the magnetos of aircraft engines. Again, long after the war ended, German agents were paying as much as $500 an ounce against the regular world price, which fluctuated around 1/10 of that figure. They knew that 5 years after Kruger and Schwend allegedly vanished, those are the guys who headed up Operation Bernhard, marked banknotes were found in circulation in these South American states. The marked notes were not forged. They were notes whose registration numbers had been recorded at the time they were purchased in Swiss banks for the forged currency. The FBI had always been denied authority to wage, quote, special operations of the kind conducted by Stevenson. In this post-war period, the normal police investigative agencies of Britain and the United States were also hamstrung. In countries that tolerate criminal activities affecting other nations, it had not been unknown for Allied agents to apply the law themselves. There was pressure from some British Treasury agents simply to wipe out the sources of the fake money. To the old professionals, it seemed as if the bureaucrats, the establishment intelligence agencies, and the departments concerned with foreign affairs had intervened. Perhaps they had. General Gehlen and his company of intelligence experts, within months of switching from Hitler's side to that of the United States, had convinced his new friends that almost anything was justified in the Cold War against communism. His agents were called V-men. They were recruited from the Gestapo and the SS. Nazi records in which Germans who voiced opposition were frequently labeled communists were suddenly an Allied index to the worthiness of West German civilians. Values must have seemed upturned, for now the middle-level Nazis could boast discreetly of their virtue as enemies of Bolshevism. I think this explains the convenient evaporation of Kruger and the bulky apparatus known as Operation Bernhard. For the man who was Kruger's real chief in this counterfeiting enterprise was Friedrich Schwend, and his partner in the business projects launched on smuggled funds was Klaus Barbie, alias the Bolivian businessman Senor Altman. By the summer of 1972, Barbie Altman was splashed across the front pages of Paris newspapers as the notorious Hangman of Lyon. He was talking to television interviewers and offering his memoirs, and he was saying repeatedly that he had done his duty as a German and that he had performed his duty to democracy as a V-man in the Gehlen organization. He named Otto Skorzeny as the chief of the network called Die Spinne. And of course, Die Spinne is the spider, one of the many, but probably among the most important, if not the most important, of the post-war sort of SS friendship organizations set up all around the world to help hide SS men and to help combat their enemies, in many cases carrying out assassinations and various terrorist activities, launched by Otto Skorzeny, otherwise known as Hitler's Commando. Again, though, notice the key play that is being given right here by Stevenson to Gehlen. Of course, this is Reinhard Gehlen, who we've talked about at great length on One Step Beyond and other programs here at KFJC. Reinhard Gehlen, the former chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front for Adolf Hitler, who, before the war had even ended, had changed allegiances, had basically turned himself over to the Allies, and had taken virtually his entire organization to the Allies, where it was made the then brand new CIA's Eastern Front intelligence operation. So we grafted on our entire intelligence operation on the Eastern Front from a Nazi cutting. No, not a Nazi cutting, a whole damn Nazi tree, actually. Now, this is significant, again, because a lot of people say, they look at this and they say, well, you know, in the context, well, people probably didn't know what was going on. It was very confusing. Well, of course it was somewhat confusing, but quite a few people knew exactly what was going on, and time after time, people who did know what was going on were thwarted by higher-ups in government who were more interested in having people of the right anti-communist persuasion, even if they were Nazi war criminals, in service and in the harness on behalf of Western interests than they were in actually bringing anybody to justice, regardless of how many people's deaths they'd been responsible for.
Okay, now, one of the things worth noting, again, about this whole rat line operation, a tripartite Vatican SS U.S. intelligence operation, is that many of its key beneficiaries and operatives, including the aforementioned Klaus Barbie, the aforementioned Fritz Schwend, and as we're going to look at in just a couple of minutes, the aforementioned Walter Rauff, all went to work in Latin America and elsewhere for U.S. intelligence. Concerning Friedrich Schwend, the mastermind and the key figure in Operation Bernhard, and his work for American intelligence, a reference to that is contained in the book The Nazi Legacy by Linklater and Ashenson. Reading from The Nazi Legacy about Schwend's work for U.S. intelligence, at the end of the war, like Klaus Barbie, Schwend worked for the Americans before escaping to South America. U.S. documents reveal that after passing into the hands of the 44th CIC detachment, he was used as an informant by American intelligence agencies in Austria, the Austrian Tyrol, and Moran, North Italy. We're going to take a look at Schwenn's work in Latin America also in the third of our broadcasts on the Vatican. So it's worth noting again that at least as far as U.S. intelligence appears to have been concerned, the main utility of the rat line was to get all of these Nazis out of Europe into or out of the clutches of anti-Nazis and into the work of U.S. intelligence.
Now, another prominent Nazi was a man by the name of Walter Rauff. Walter Rauff was down in the chain of command, but he was the man who was in charge of the mobile gas chambers, as will be mentioned in this article, underneath Adolf Eichmann in the earliest part of putting together the final solution scenario.
And Rauff was the fellow who had specialized in anti-communist operations in Italy for the Nazis, and then as we looked at in the first part of the Peter Dale Scott article from Covert Action that we're going to continue with here, then proceeded to perform the same function for Allen Dulles and OSS in Italy.
Indeed, and this is again the Peter Dale Scott article from Covert Action Information Bulletin. Walter Rauff, who had negotiated in Milan with Dulles' aide Daddario, was also spared, despite having directed the mobile gas chambers in Nazi-occupied Russia. By his own account, which has been reported as fact in the U.S. press, Rauff, quote, escaped after his arrest by U.S. troops to move with Vatican help first to Vatican City and then to Syria. British and French sources agree, however, that Rauff, by as early as June 1945, had established himself in Genoa. Let me just mention, of course, that was also Klaus Barbie's story for a long time, or at least the U.S. story was that Klaus Barbie had, quote, escaped, and it only came out in the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, Klaus Barbie was allowed to escape by U.S. intelligence, whom he was working for. So anyway, British and French sources agree that Rauff, by as early as June 1945, had established himself in Genoa. There, with the aid of Cardinal Siri, the Bishop of Genoa, Rauff organized a transit camp where as many as 5,000 fleeing Nazis were sheltered before their departure to Argentina, Syria, or Egypt. The French Nazi hunter, Beate Klarsfeld, agreed that, like his Kameradenwerk ally Schwenn, Rauff, too, was working with U.S. intelligence before escaping to Chile. And, of course, after he escaped to Chile, Walter Rauff went to work for the Chilean secret police, the DINA, the DINA, where he helped to put together the operation at Colonia Dignidad, which is probably the worst prison camp, concentration camp, in the entire North and South American continental mass, and was there until his alleged death a couple of years ago.
Okay. Now, again, note the work of all of these people for U.S. intelligence. Now, we're going to take up now a little bit of the association of the Third Reich, or of fascism and the Vatican after the war. Obviously, the Operation Bernhard rat line began during the latter stages of the war and was continuous throughout the conclusion of the war on into the Cold War period itself. In the Cold War period, the Vatican continued to look with favor on Nazi elements, particularly those that could avail them in their perceived struggle, or actual struggle, actually, against communism. And one of the organizations that we're going to be looking at now is an organization called the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, also known as the Knights of Malta. We're going to talk about them, some of the people in them, in just a second. An excellent article on the Knights of Malta, and unfortunately I forgot to Xerox off the title page of the article. I think it's called There Will Be, in fact I'm positive it's called There Will Be Done. Anyway, the article was authored by Martin Lee. It's about the Knights of Malta and the CIA influence in the Vatican, and it's from Mother Jones issue of July 1983. Again, Martin Lee, There Will Be Done, from Mother Jones, July 1983. Picking up here a brief review of the rat line, and then we're going to move into the Knights of Malta. Martin Lee writes as follows. But the needy, aided by certain SMOM members, that's the Knights of Malta, in the late 1940s, were some 50,000 Nazi war criminals who, with the assistance of the International Red Cross, were furnished fake Vatican passports and, in some cases, clerical robes, and were smuggled on Bishop Alois Hudall's Underground Railroad to South America. Among those was Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. In 1948, the SMOM gave one of its highest awards of honor, the Gran Croce al Merito con Placa, to General Reinhard Gehlen, Adolf Hitler's chief anti-Soviet spy. Only 3 other people received this award. By the way, I would add that is in the 1,000-year history of the Knights of Malta, so Gehlen was only the 4th recipient of the award in roughly a millennium. Gehlen, who was not a Catholic, was touted as a formidable ally in the Holy Crusade against godless Marxism. After the war, he and his well-developed spy apparatus, staffed largely by ex-Nazis, joined the fledgling CIA. Eventually, hundreds more Nazis ended up on the U.S. government's payroll. Among them was Klaus Barbie. Now, again, note that Galen, only the fourth person in the roughly 1,000-year history of the Knights of Malta to receive that award, the Gran Croce al Merito con Placa. Okay, now, the Knights of Malta, basically, to make a long story short, and we're going to go into them in much, much greater detail later in the series, the Knights of Malta, basically, for all intents and purposes, is the military wing of the Catholic Church. It's a church order, and its members are officially knighted, and it involves, for our purposes, a number of very, very key figures in the U.S. political establishment and the national security, intelligence, and defense establishments in particular, and also a number of other arch-reactionary figures throughout history. Obviously, Galen received its award. Some of the members include William Casey, the current head of the Central Intelligence Agency and the head of the Special Intelligence Division of OSS during World War II. Also, both Buckleys, William and James Buckley, Lee Iacocca, John McCone, head of the CIA when Kennedy was assassinated, Alexander Haig, former Secretary of State under the Reagan administration, William Wilson, the current Reagan ambassador to the Vatican, Robert Wagner, former mayor of New York City, and a lot of other key people in the U.S. intelligence and military establishment.
I don't know if you mentioned James Jesus Angleton, who was formerly, actually at the time of the war, when Casey was the one of the head of, what was Casey head of in Rome?
He was head of the OSS Special Intelligence in Europe.
Okay, and Angleton was head of the Rome station for the OSS during that war. Angleton later won another very important award, and later on he was, of course, the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA during the late 50s and early 60s.
And also was instrumental in rescuing a man named Prince Giusto Valerio Borghese, or Giusto probably to give it an Italian pronunciation. We're going to be talking about him and the whole propaganda Douay Lodge tangle later in the broadcast. Now, one of the most important people, a member of the American Knights of Malta, is a man named J. Peter Grace. Grace is also a member of the Reagan administration, being head of Reagan's Businessman's Commission on Cutting Costs in Government. It's also worth noting for our purposes here that J. Peter Grace has a long-standing affiliation with the U.S. intelligence establishment, chiefly through an organization called the American Institute for Free Labor Development. That is a CIA front that has been very active, I should say, and in Latin America and elsewhere to break up powerful labor unions and to make the situation more felicitous for corporate development. J. Peter Grace is a key element of the American Knights of Malta, also a very, very key figure in the Reagan administration. Now, J. Peter Grace and his role in the Knights of Malta here, recall Galen's decoration by the Knights, is very important here because we're going to take a look now at some contemporary associations between die-hard fascist elements, including some people with connections to some of the most heinous of all Nazi operations, and the Vatican to this day, including Pope John Paul II. And again, this may seem a little bit startling. What we're going to be doing now is playing a section of a Hard Rain show, which some years back, when we were not aware of how long the Mediterranean merry-go-round would keep going around, on the now defunct Hard Rain show, at least on this station, I undertook about a 26-part series while we were working on it together on One Step Beyond. And basically, this program is from roughly February or March of 1983. It was at that time, the 15th program in a 26-part series about the Mediterranean merry-go-round, which I'd say covered a little over half the material. There's so much that has happened in the roughly 3 years since that time. To give you an idea of what a massive tangle this is and why we're devoting 25 hours, as I say, this half-hour segment, or roughly half-hour segment you're about to hear, was the 15th program in a 26-part series, which didn't even come close to covering the basics in the issue. But in this program, which is called the Vatican Auschwitz IG Farben connection, you're going to hear about some insidious links between the Vatican and Auschwitz, and some of these links are apparently still functional today.
Okay, so going on and playing again, as Dave said, from approximately February or March of 1983, A Hard Rain featuring Dave Emery.
My name is Dave Emery. It's time once again for Hard Rain. For the past several weeks, we've been talking about an organization called the Knights of Malta. Its formal title is the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. That basically is the military order of the Catholic Church. It was founded during the Crusades, so it's roughly 1,000 years old, and the Knights of Malta is significant for us today because the Knights of Malta involves a great number of very important people on the American political and intelligence scene, as well as the military and industrial community. In other words, many people who are very influential in the U.S. military establishment, the U.S. intelligence establishment, the U.S. political, and the U.S. financial establishments are very, very well placed within the Knights of Malta. One of the individuals that we've spoken about in connection with the Knights of Malta is a man named J. Peter Grace. J. Peter Grace is the driving force behind W.R. Grace & Company, a chemical company. 8 different key members of the American sector of the Knights of Malta are involved with W.R. Grace & Company, and the chairman of that, the aforementioned J. Peter Grace, is the head of the American sector or chapter of the Knights of Malta. In connection with our discussion of J. Peter Grace, which occupied just about all of the last broadcast that we did on this subject, we talked in particular about a couple of aspects of J. Peter Grace's career that we're going to take up at greater length today. First of all, we spoke about the fact that J. Peter Grace's company, W.R. Grace & Company, had been reported by Nazi hunter Charles Allen to be using various key Nazi war criminals and technocrats from Project Paperclip, a project whereby key Nazi military industrialists were brought over by the United States to work within our own defense industry. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the appointment of J. Peter Grace by President Ronald Reagan to a special President's Advisory Board on cutting costs in government. This special advisory board is to be made up of businessmen, and it is headed by J. Peter Grace. All of this is basically going to lead us into a discussion of one of the most important and least known and very terrifying aspects of the Vatican today, namely the profound intersection between the papacy, between the Vatican and Auschwitz. And that's what we're that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the Vatican, Auschwitz, IG Farben connection. Now, the first thing we're going to be talking about today is basically the relationship between the aforementioned J. Peter Grace and a man named Dr. Otto Ambros. Dr. Otto Ambros is a key member of the Nazi IG Farben chemical cartel, and he has served as a personal friend and technical advisor to J. Peter Grace and W.R. Grace & Company for many years. Otto Ambros was the German industrialist who selected the town of Auschwitz as the site for several IG Farben installations due to a number of different angles, not the least of which was the availability of slave labor. Otto Ambros was also IG Farben's expert for poison gas. And he also, by the way, helped develop the root technology that resulted in the development of magnetic tape. We're going to be talking about that. Following that, we're going to take a look at just how Dr. Otto Ambros came to select Auschwitz as the site for the IG Farben installation. We're also going to take a look at some of the working conditions that prevailed at Auschwitz. We're going to take a look at, following our look at Dr. Otto Ambros and his relationship with Sovereign Military Order of Malta luminary J. Peter Grace, we're going to be taking a look at a fellow named Dr. Hermann Abs. Dr. Hermann Abs was chairman of the Deutsche Bank, one of the largest financial institutions in Germany, both under Hitler and today. He was one of the most important figures in Hitler's industry, both before, during, and after the Second World War. Hermann Abs was also one of the key managing directors for the aforementioned IG Farben chemical cartel. Hermann Abs was responsible for putting forth the venture capital to build the IG Farben plants at Auschwitz, those sites having been selected by Dr. Otto Ambros and one of the key plants managed by Otto Ambros. Following that, we're going to take a look at the fact that Pope John Paul II used to work at an IG Farben installation in Poland. We don't know whether this IG Farben installation was IG Auschwitz, but there's circumstantial evidence suggesting that it was, because certainly we know that the Pope was working for an IG Farben subsidiary, and we also know that he was working in the general area of Auschwitz. We don't know whether it was actually IG Auschwitz, but in light of the involvement, or the intersection, I really should say, of both Dr. Otto Ambros and Hermann Abs with the Vatican, both of those guys instrumental in setting up the IG Farben installations at the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp, it's certainly worth our attention and worth asking just what was the Pope doing at the IG Farben installations during World War II? How is it that these two individuals, these two heinous Nazi war criminals, came to be affiliated with the Vatican? This is the subject of our discussion today.